Greetings, my scattered sisters and brothers in the Lord. Trust you know the Lord is with you wherever you find yourself scattered today, and that you know that His presence with you is more than enough for whatever you might face today. Well, I've been thinking more about Jesus' conversation with the scribe. The scribe asked Jesus what the greatest commandment was, and Jesus actually told him the two greatest commandments. One, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength. And the second one, to love your neighbor as yourself. And the scribe responded to Jesus that Jesus answered well. And I've been thinking more about the scribe's response. This is what he says. It's in Mark chapter 12, beginning at verse 32. And the scribe said to Jesus, "You are right, teacher. You have truly said that He is one and there is no other besides Him. And to love Him with all the heart and with all the understanding, with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is much more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices." And when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." So the scribe told Jesus that Jesus was answered well, and that yes, God is one. Yes, we're to love Him with our whole being, and we're to love our neighbor as ourselves, and then that's greater than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. And so, where did the scribe come up with this? Maybe the scribe was thinking back in the Old Testament where Samuel told King Saul that obedience is better than sacrifice. Could be. But I also wonder if the scribe had been there at the temple, because that's where the conversation was taking place at. And the scribe had seen people bringing their sacrifices. And as they brought their sacrifices, they offered their sacrifices, but they didn't offer themselves. See, that was how a sacrifice was supposed to be offered, that the sacrifice would represent you, and that as you gave the sacrifice, you were giving yourself through the sacrifice. And you'll notice that the scribe said whole burnt offerings. Well, in a whole burnt offering, the whole animal is placed on the altar. It's slaughtered, placed on the altar, and offered up to God through the flames, through the smoke. And so nothing is taking off, nothing is pulled back. The whole thing is offered to God. And when you made a whole burnt offering, what that symbolized, at least in part, was that you are offering your whole self to God through the offering of that animal. Now, what I'm wondering is if the scribe saw people kind of approaching the sacrifice and offering the sacrifice almost so that they wouldn't have to offer themselves to God. It's like, I gave the sacrifice in my place so that I don't have to offer myself to God. Rather than the sacrifice representing them and giving themselves to God, is like, I gave my sacrifice so that I don't have to give myself to God. And the scribe would no doubt have seen how wrong that was, how inappropriate that was. And so the scribe is saying, Jesus, you're right on, that we need to love God with our heart, our soul, our mind, our whole heart, our whole soul, our whole mind, with all of our strength, holding nothing back, because that's how we're supposed to live. And when sacrifices become a way to avoid giving our whole selves to God, when sacrifices become a way to avoid giving our whole selves to one another, that's the problem. And that's what the scribe was watching. And that's why the scribe was so delighted in the way that Jesus responded. And I think it's why Jesus was delighted in the way that the scribe responded. They were on the same page, that what we need to do is be giving ourselves completely to God and be giving ourselves to one another, to our neighbor. And so that's got me thinking, how much do we, avoid giving ourselves to God? Like, we might give our money to God, but are we giving our money to God so that we don't have to give ourselves to God? Our time. I wonder if sometimes we actually give our time to God so that we don't have to give ourselves to God. We might be giving time to God on a Sunday morning. We might be giving time to God on a mission trip or something. But in the process that we're doing that, we're kind of avoiding giving ourselves to God. And I think the same thing could be true in terms of our love for one another, that sometimes we will do things for each other so that we don't have to give ourselves to each other. And so I really hear Jesus calling us and the scribe echoing the call that, hey, it's not about sacrifice. It's not about, things that you can do in place of giving yourself. No, what it's really all about is giving ourselves unrelinquished totally to God. And likewise, that's how we're supposed to love each other, to give ourselves to each other. One last thought. This is just response. God gave himself through his Son for us so that we could give ourselves to God and to each other. So the initiative is not with us. God has already done the ultimate giving. And now we're supposed to give ourselves in response. How can we not, given the gifting that God has done in giving us his Son? So wherever you find yourself scattered today, I think that's the fresh challenge. Not to give sacrifices, not to give things in place of ourselves, but to actually give ourselves wholeheartedly to God and to each other. God bless. May it be a giving day because God so gave to us.